The dispute over water rights between Egypt and Ethiopia primarily revolves around the Nile River, which is one of the longest rivers in the world. The river flows through multiple countries, but its two main tributaries are the Blue Nile, which originates in Ethiopia, and the White Nile, which flows from Uganda and South Sudan. The complexities of this dispute can be understood by examining historical agreements, geographical realities, and current developments.
Historical context. The roots of Egypt's claims to a higher share of Nile water can be traced back to colonial-era agreements. The most significant of these is the 1929 agreement between Egypt and Britain, which controlled Sudan at that time. This agreement granted Egypt a substantial share of the Nile's waters, approximately 48 billion cubic meters annually, while limiting Sudan's rights. In 1959, another agreement was made between Egypt and Sudan that allocated 55.5 billion cubic meters to Egypt and 18.5 billion cubic meters to Sudan, effectively excluding upstream countries like Ethiopia from any negotiations or allocations. Ethiopia argues that these agreements are outdated and do not reflect current realities since they were made without considering upstream nations' rights. As Ethiopia is home to around 85% of the Nile's water flow due to its highland geography, where rainfall is abundant, it believes it has a legitimate claim to utilize this resource for its development needs.
Geopolitical dynamics. Development Needs Ethiopia is undergoing significant economic development and sees the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, as crucial for generating hydroelectric power to support its growing population and economy. This dam has become a focal point in the dispute because it will significantly alter water flow downstream. Egypt's concerns. For Egypt, which relies on the Nile for about 90% of its freshwater supply, any reduction in water flow poses existential threats to its agriculture and overall water security. Thus, Egypt views any unilateral actions by Ethiopia regarding dam construction or water management as a direct threat to its national security.
Legal frameworks, play a crucial role in resolving international disputes. When it comes to the Nile, various treaties and agreements have been put in place over the years. However, these agreements often reflect the interests of colonial powers and not the current realities. Ethiopia, for instance, was not a party to many of these historical treaties, so they argue that they are not bound by them. On the other hand, Egypt relies heavily on these agreements to assert its water rights. International water law, like the principles of equitable and reasonable utilization, aims to balance the needs of all riparian states. But the interpretation of these principles can vary widely, leading to, more disputes. Current negotiations are trying to find a middle ground that respects both historical agreements and contemporary needs. It's a complex legal landscape, and reaching a consensus is, honestly, quite challenging. In the end, legal frameworks provide a foundation, but the resolution of such disputes often requires diplomatic and political solutions as well. International water law. Under international law principles concerning transboundary rivers, states have an obligation to cooperate with one another regarding shared water resources. The UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses emphasizes equitable utilization and sustainable management of shared waters. Current negotiations. Despite various rounds of negotiations mediated by different parties, including the African Union and other international stakeholders, no comprehensive agreement has been reached that satisfies both nations' concerns regarding water allocation and dam operations.
In summary, Egypt's claims for a higher share of Nile waters than Ethiopia stem from historical agreements established during colonial times that favored downstream countries while neglecting upstream nations' rights. Given that most of the Nile's water originates in Ethiopia, there exists a fundamental conflict between historical entitlements claimed by Egypt and Ethiopia's right to develop its resources for national growth.
Egypt claims higher water share rights than Ethiopia based on colonial-era agreements that favor downstream nations despite most Nile waters originating from Ethiopian sources. This creates tension over equitable resource distribution amidst modern development needs.